A French government official sat down at a press briefing on April 8, 2026, and said, out loud, on the record, that France can no longer accept not having control over its own data and digital infrastructure. He said the goal was to regain control of our digital destiny. And when a reporter asked Microsoft for a comment, Microsoft, one of the most aggressive, litigious, lobbying-heavy technology corporations on the planet, they said nothing. A spokesperson did not comment. That silence is the entire story. Here is what actually happened on April 8, 2026, stripped of the clickbait framing that most of the coverage used and the dismissive framing that the other half used. France's DINAM, the Interministerial Directorate for Digital Affairs, the central body that sets technology policy across the entire French civil service, announced that it is migrating its own workstations from Windows to Linux. That is the part most headlines got right. What the headlines either buried or missed entirely is the second half of the announcement. DINAM simultaneously issued a directive ordering every single government ministry to produce a formal plan to eliminate non-European digital dependencies by autumn 2026. Not to consider it, not to discuss it, to produce a plan with a deadline. The directive covers operating systems, collaborative tools, cloud infrastructure, and artificial intelligence platforms. It affects an estimated just 5 million civil servants. This is not a story about one French government agency with fewer than 500 employees switching to Linux. That framing, which appeared in several outlets trying to puncture the headline, is technically accurate about DINAM's own headcount and entirely misleading about what was actually announced. DINAM is the organization that sets the policy. The policy applies to the entire French government apparatus. The 5 million figure is the correct scale of what this directive is pointed at, and the autumn 2026 deadline for ministry-level implementation plans is real and binding. French Minister David Amiel framed the announcement in language that does not use technology jargon or productivity benchmarks. He said France would regain control of our digital destiny by relying less on US tech companies. He said the French government can no longer accept not having control over its data and digital infrastructure. That is not the language of an IT refresh. That is the language of a geopolitical decision that happens to involve software procurement, and understanding that distinction is the only way to correctly read everything that follows. Before we talk about what Microsoft's silence actually means and where this goes next, we need to spend some time on the reason France can make this announcement with any credibility at all. Because the history of governments announcing Linux migrations and then quietly crawling back to Windows is long, well documented, and genuinely embarrassing for everyone involved. Munich is the canonical example. Starting in 2003, the city of Munich began one of the most ambitious government Linux migrations in European history, a project called Linux that converted thousands of city workstations from Windows to a custom Linux distribution. The project ran into compatibility issues, user complaints, and sustained vendor pressure. In 2016, Microsoft relocated its German headquarters to Munich. In 2017, Munich's city council voted to abandon Linux and return to Windows. The entire exercise, a decade of effort and expense, reversed in one council vote. France has a different data point, and it is a real one. The Gendarmerie Nationale, France's national police force, began a phased transition away from proprietary software in 2004, starting with Firefox, Thunderbird, and OpenOffice on Windows machines before progressively rebuilding the infrastructure for a full operating system migration. By 2008, they had begun deploying Genbuntu, a customized Ubuntu derivative built specifically for gendarmerie operations. As of April 2026, Genbuntu is running on more than 103,000 workstations across the gendarmerie. Not 103,000 in a pilot program. 103,000 in active daily operational use by a law enforcement organization that cannot afford prolonged downtime or software incompatibilities in the field. The gendarmerie estimates it saves approximately 2 million euros annually compared to Windows licensing and maintenance costs at that scale. That is why France's April 8th announcement is categorically different from Munich 2003, or the dozen other government Linux migration announcements that dissolved quietly over the previous 2 decades. The proof of concept already exists inside a French government institution at genuine operational scale, with 18 years of continuous deployment demonstrating that the approach is viable. DINAM is not proposing something experimental. It is proposing to extend a model that is already working across a much larger portion of the same government. The expected Linux distribution for the broader migration is Genbuntu, though this has not been officially confirmed, which means the government is almost certainly looking at deploying a proven, internally supported system rather than asking 5 million civil servants to navigate an unfamiliar distribution chosen through a procurement process. The Linux migration is the most visible element of France's announcement, but it is specifically not the whole picture. And understanding the full scope of what France is doing is essential to understanding why Microsoft's silence is the appropriate response rather than the dismissive one. The April 8th Linux Directive is the third major pillar of a digital sovereignty strategy that has been accelerating visibly since late 2024. In January 2026, France issued a binding mandate replacing Microsoft Teams, Zoom, WebEx, and GoToMeeting with Visio, a domestic Jitsi-based video conferencing platform across all 2.5 million civil servants, with full deployment required by 2027. That mandate was already underway before the Linux announcement arrived. The La Suite Numérique, France's homegrown productivity platform hosted entirely on Outscale servers, a subsidiary of Dassault Systèmes, and certified Secnum Cloud by the French National Information Security Agency, ANSSI, had been tested by 40,000 regular users across departments by April 2026. The June 2026 industrial digital meetings are scheduled to formalize public-private coalitions to support the transition, bringing domestic technology vendors into a coordinated supply chain rather than continuing to route government procurement toward American platforms. What France is executing is not a Linux migration. It is a full-stack replacement of American digital infrastructure with European alternatives at every layer simultaneously: the operating system, the collaboration tools, the productivity suite, the cloud infrastructure, the health data platforms. The operating system switch gets the headlines because it is the most legible change for a general audience. But the French government has been clear that the sovereignty project does not stop at the desktop, and the desktop is simply the most visible layer of a restructuring that runs all the way down to which cloud servers government data sits on and which legal jurisdiction those servers operate under. This matters for understanding Microsoft's position because the company is not facing a procurement decision that can be reversed through a relationship with a ministry IT director. It is facing a national policy decision driven by geopolitical considerations that have nothing to do with whether Windows or Linux is the better operating system in a technical sense. France is not leaving Windows because Linux is better. France is leaving Windows because Windows is American, and France has concluded that American software running on American servers under American legal jurisdiction is a structural vulnerability it can no longer operate with given the geopolitical environment of 2026. Digital sovereignty has been discussed in European policy circles since at least 2018, and the European Parliament voted in January 2026 to adopt a report directing the European Commission to identify areas where the EU can reduce its reliance on foreign providers. So the policy direction is not new. What changed is the urgency, and the urgency has a specific cause: Trump's tariff policies and the broader posture of the current U.S. administration toward European allies since January 2025 triggered a specific and measurable response in European technology procurement. OVH Cloud and Scaleway, France's domestic cloud providers, reported record client growth as European institutions began actively seeking to reduce their exposure to American cloud infrastructure from April 2025 onward. In November 2025, France and Germany convened a joint summit on European digital sovereignty, establishing a task force with a 2026 reporting deadline. The Trump administration's willingness to use economic leverage, sanctions, and trade pressure as tools of geopolitical negotiation has made European governments acutely aware that their dependence on American technology infrastructure is not a neutral procurement preference. It is a point of structural exposure to American political decisions they have no ability to influence or predict. When French Minister Amiel says France can no longer accept not having control over its data and digital infrastructure, he is not making a theoretical argument about software philosophy. He is making a risk management argument in a geopolitical environment where the United States government has demonstrated it is willing to use technology access as a negotiating instrument. France's response is to remove the dependency that creates the vulnerability, and the operating system is one layer of that dependency. Germany's Schleswig-Holstein state has already demonstrated this approach at meaningful scale. Having begun its Microsoft to Linux transition in earnest in 2024, Schleswig-Holstein had completed nearly 80% of its 30,000 workstation migration by early 2026, recording savings of 15 million euros in licensing costs in 2026 alone. That is a completed data point, not a projection, demonstrating that a phased, governance-supported migration from Windows to Linux in a government environment is executable and generates the savings it promises. When TechCrunch reached out to Microsoft for comment on France's announcement, a spokesperson did not comment. That is the complete Microsoft response to one of the largest government Linux migrations ever announced by a G7 nation. Microsoft's silence is not an accident, and it is not an oversight. It is a calculated decision made by a company that understands the constraints of its current position relative to the European regulatory environment with more precision than any headline writer does. Microsoft has been operating under the EU's Digital Markets Act since 2024. Which imposes interoperability requirements and anti-competitive behavior restrictions on designated gatekeeper platforms. The European Commission fined Microsoft 561 million euros in 2013 for failing to offer browser choice. The company has spent years building a relationship with European regulators that involves demonstrating cooperation rather than confrontation. Responding to France's Linux announcement with anything that could be characterized as hostile, dismissive, or lobbying adjacent would be strategically damaging in a regulatory environment where the relationship with Brussels is worth considerably more than the optics of any individual government procurement decision. But there is a deeper and more interesting reason for the silence, and it is the one that actually tells you what Microsoft thinks about the long-term trajectory of what France announced. Microsoft already provides governments with source code access to Windows and other platforms, specifically, so those governments can verify there are no backdoors. The company made that accommodation years ago precisely because it understood that governments operate under sovereignty. Requirements that commercial enterprises do not. The problem France is describing in 2026 is not a backdoor problem. It is not even primarily a security problem in the conventional sense. It is a jurisdictional problem, a concern that software created, updated, and legally controlled by an American corporation operating under American law cannot be the infrastructure foundation of a sovereign government's digital operations in a world where that American legal jurisdiction can be weaponized. Microsoft providing source code access does not solve that problem. There is no product modification, no licensing concession, and no government relations campaign that resolves the fundamental issue France is raising, which is that Windows is American, and France has decided that being American is the disqualifying attribute. That is why Microsoft said nothing. Because there is nothing to say that changes the calculation France has already made. Let us put a number on what France's decision actually costs Microsoft, because the financial dimension is real, even if it is not the primary driver of the story. Analysts estimate the total cost of France's migration at between 5 billion and 3 billion euros over a 5 to 7 year implementation period, factoring in hardware upgrades, software development, training, and support infrastructure. That figure represents money France is choosing to spend on the transition rather than continuing to pay Microsoft licensing fees. The annual licensing cost Microsoft will lose when 5 million government workstations move off Windows is significant even at the enterprise pricing levels that large government clients negotiate. At a conservative estimate of 100 euros per workstation per year, in combined Windows and Microsoft 365 licensing, the annual figure is 250 million euros. Over a 5-year period, that is 25 billion euros of revenue that Microsoft does not capture from French government contracts. The actual figure is likely higher once you account for the Teams replacement, the cloud migration away from Azure to sovereign European providers, and the downstream effect on Microsoft's position in French public sector procurement more broadly. Microsoft 365 pricing is also increasing across Europe, starting in July 2026, with plans rising by up to 7% according to published pricing changes. Schleswig-Holstein specifically cited that price increase as a factor in the financial case for their Linux migration, saving 15 million euros in licensing costs in 2026 alone on 30,000 workstations. The price increase that Microsoft is implementing to fund its AI infrastructure build-out is simultaneously strengthening the financial case for every European government that is already considering a sovereignty-motivated migration. The timing is not ideal for Microsoft's European government business. Beyond the direct French government revenue, the demonstration effect is the more significant financial risk. If a G7 nation with 2.5 million civil servants successfully completes a phased migration from Windows to Linux within a governance framework that other European governments can replicate, the procurement calculus changes across the continent. Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, Belgium, every European government that has been watching the sovereignty debate unfold now has a working reference implementation to point to when internal advocates argue for migration. France is not just leaving Windows. France is building the case study that every other European government will cite in 2027 and 2028 when their own procurement decisions come up for review. There are legitimate criticisms of France's approach, and the script of this video would not be honest if it did not address them. The most substantive critique is the one made by analysts at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, who pointed out that the French directive contains no published productivity assessment, no total cost model, and no reversion threshold if the initiative fails to meet performance targets. The migration is being driven by sovereignty logic, not by a demonstrated productivity or cost advantage, and the French government has not published an analysis showing that civil servants on Linux with La Suite Numérique will work as effectively as civil servants on Windows with Microsoft 365. That is a real gap, and the history of government IT projects that substituted political objectives for rigorous feasibility analysis is not reassuring. The structural irony embedded in France's sovereignty strategy is also worth naming precisely. Even as France replaces Windows with Linux and Teams with Visio at the desktop layer, the 12 European AI startups selected for Amazon's 2026 AWS Pioneers cohort illustrate that the continent's most ambitious technology projects are still being built and scaled on American cloud infrastructure. Replacing the desktop operating system addresses one layer of American technology dependency while leaving the cloud and compute substrate, which is where the actual data processing, the actual AI workloads, and the actual infrastructure sovereignty questions reside, predominantly American. France can run Genbuntu on every civil servant's laptop and still have its most sensitive government data processed on servers in Virginia. There are also specialist software dependencies in defense, healthcare, and financial regulation that have deep integrations with Windows-specific applications for which open-source alternatives either do not exist or are not yet production-ready. Dynam has acknowledged this through the flexibility built into the ministry-level planning framework, but the question of how many of those dependencies can realistically be resolved by a government mandate and a 2026 planning deadline will be answered over the next 2 to 3 years, not by any announcement made this spring. These are real limitations. They do not change the direction of travel. They change the timeline and the complexity of execution. Here is the clean summary of what April 8th, 2026 actually represents for anyone who covers the intersection of technology, policy, and the operating system market. France made a decision that is geopolitical in motivation, digital sovereignty in framing, and specifically targeted at reducing structural exposure to American technology jurisdiction in a world where that jurisdiction has become a geopolitical instrument. The decision is backed by an 18-year proof of concept in the gendarmerie, a coordinated European policy environment, a completed reference implementation in Schleswig-Holstein, and a domestic technology ecosystem, OVH Cloud, Outscale, Visio, La Suite Numérique, that is further developed than most external observers realize. Microsoft responded with silence, because silence is the only response that does not make the situation worse in a European regulatory environment where confrontation carries costs the company cannot afford. The silence is not confidence. It is the acknowledgement of a constraint. Linux desktop market share has reached its highest point in history at approximately 5% of the global desktop market as of early 2026, up from 1% in early 2024. The Windows 10 end-of-support event in October 2025 displaced 240 million PCs and pushed a measurable portion of those users toward Linux distributions for the first time. Now, a G7 government has added 5 million workstations to the migration pipeline with a binding interministerial mandate and a hard planning deadline of autumn 2026. The year of the Linux desktop, the punchline that the open source community has been making for 20 years, is not arriving in the consumer market in the way anyone predicted. It is arriving in the corridors of government, driven not by technical enthusiasm, but by geopolitical necessity, which is a far more durable and difficult to reverse driver than any technical argument for Linux ever produced. Microsoft has a very specific window to demonstrate that Windows 11 is a reliable, trustworthy, non-exploitable platform for government operations before the French model becomes the template every other European government references in its next procurement cycle. If Windows 11's reliability problems and forced AI integrations continue to generate the backlash they have generated through 2025 and into 2026, the conversation in European government IT departments stops being whether to follow France and starts being when. Subscribe for the complete follow-up covering Germany's full Schleswig-Holstein migration results, which other European governments have active Linux transition discussions underway, and what Genbuntu actually looks like running in production across 103,000 government workstations. The story France started on April 8th is not finished. It is starting,